Joe Biden is the best president in modern history. Trump was the worst and now is the most dangerous candidate in American history. If you disagree with me, there's likely some things you don't know about Biden's record compared to Trump's, because in an effort to not seem biased amidst Trump's relentless attacks, the mainstream media has largely been silent on the threat he poses to this country and all that has been done by the Biden administration to improve the lives of ordinary Americans. Instead, the media has been focused on Biden's age and his recent debate performance. I'll be honest, I have my doubts about his mental acuity, his decision to run for re-election, and frankly, his ability to win this election. That's why I'm making this video. But what I don't doubt is that he's achieved miraculous accomplishments, governs with a steady hand, and is a far better president and human being than Donald Trump. So let's start with the economy. Trumpers will say things like Biden ruined the economy, which is ironic given that Trump is the first president since Herbert Hoover, who was in office during the Great Depression, to lose more jobs in the course of their presidencies than they created. Now one might say, hey, the pandemic happened in 2020, it's not Trump's fault. Yes, an economic crisis to some extent was unavoidable, but the way in which the economy crashed, losing over 20 million jobs, could have been avoided if it weren't for Trump's incompetence. COVID, of course, came from Wuhan, China, and 45 nations imposed travel restrictions on China before the United States did. Some countries did it 9 whole days before we did on February 2nd. Then, on February 7th, Trump was recorded in a private conversation telling journalist Bob Woodward he knew the virus was, quote, more deadly than even your strenuous flu, but wanted to downplay it publicly. So he held rallies without masks, resulting in hundreds of his own supporters and those closest to them dying, and mocked those who wore masks, like at the time candidate Joe Biden. There began the politicization of public health measures that went on to fuel the fire of anti-vaccine and anti-science propaganda. Trump expanded travel restrictions to Iran on February 28th and to European nations on March 12th. But at that point, the US was already approaching 2,000 confirmed cases, allowing COVID to infest the country and creating high transmission zones, which is why states had to lock down. Hospitals were overwhelmed with COVID patients, leading to people sick with other ailments dying from a lack of care. Schools had to close and go virtual, businesses shut down, some of which never came back. Tens of millions of jobs went down the drain and 350,831 Americans died from COVID just in 2020 because of his failure. Compare that to President Biden, who came into office and immediately signed into law his COVID stimulus bill, put $1,400 in the pockets of ordinary Americans, provided the resources to the states to vaccinate the country, provided loans to small businesses to stay afloat, included an enhanced child tax credit that cut child poverty in half in 2021, and contributed to our record economic growth, giving us the title of the fastest recovering advanced nation in the world. Almost 16 million jobs have been created under Biden, also thanks to the infrastructure bill, Rebuilding America, the CHIPS and Science Act, investing in American manufacturing, and the Inflation Reduction Act, investing in clean energy to fight climate change, as we'll discuss. And yes, Biden's legislation did contribute to our miraculous economic recovery, according to most economists, debunking Trump's myth that all of these jobs are just people coming back to work after COVID. In fact, if you compare both of their terms and cut out 2020 due to the pandemic and 2021 due to the recovery, in terms of job creation, 2022 outpaces 2017, 2023 outpaces 2018, and 2024 has seen more jobs created than in 2019. Unemployment has now been at or under 4% for 2 years, the longest streak of rock-bottom jobless rates since the Vietnam War. Inflation has also come down from 9 to 3%. Gas prices have as well. Some of you may be thinking, well, if that's true, why are prices still so high? Well, how about you ask the corporate CEOs who raked in record profits? They could easily lower prices, but then how would they afford their second or third yacht? So keep this in mind. Every time you blame Joe Biden for high prices, you're giving cover to multi-billion-dollar corporations and CEOs who will make all of us suffer so that they can hoard more wealth than they could ever spend. And they want you to blame Biden, because through his Inflation Reduction Act, Biden established a 15% minimum tax on corporations raking in at least $1 billion a year so that they can no longer pay nothing in taxes. Republicans in Congress voted against that and also protected massive oil companies by killing a bill that would have stopped price gouging at the pump. These special interests want Joe Biden and the Democrats to lose because guess who they're running against? Trump and the Republicans, who cut taxes for the rich in 2017, adding trillions to the national debt. At a fundraiser for this election, Trump acknowledged the filthy rich donors in the crowd and promised to slash their taxes even further. Instead of a $2 trillion tax cut like before, he now wants a $5 trillion tax cut for the super wealthy. To add insult to injury, he plans to do the exact opposite to ordinary Americans, proposing a 10% tariff on every single imported item and a 60% levy on imports from China, which economists have projected will reignite inflation and amount to $2,500 being added to a typical middle-income American household's expenses every single year. It's a Republican playbook: socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. Biden, on the other hand, is fighting for ordinary Americans. His Inflation Reduction Act lowered healthcare costs, capping insulin for seniors on Medicare at $35 a month, and allowing Medicare to negotiate lower prescription drug prices. And one more thing. Because of Biden, crippling student loan debt has been canceled from 4 million borrowers. You may remember he had an even more comprehensive plan to cancel student debt that would have benefited even more people. But the Supreme Court, largely shaped by Trump's appointments, snatched that economic freedom out of millions of Americans' hands by striking down Biden's program. But that's not the only time Trump's Supreme Court issued a morally important decision. This one, decided by 5 justices, 3 of which were appointed by Trump, which was the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, abolishing the constitutional right to an abortion and making possible extreme abortion bans without exceptions for rape and incest. This isn't surprising given the fact that he said, quote, "There has to be some form of punishment for women who receive an abortion." Well, here's the punishment he inflicted. Endless horrific cases of women being prosecuted for having miscarriages, being denied an abortion even when without it, their life would be at risk, like Kate Cox in Texas. Most bans have medical exceptions, but whether a woman's life is in danger enough to justify an abortion is oftentimes contentious for Republican politicians who think they know better than women and their doctors about their own bodies. Underage rape victims have been put through hell. A 13-year-old in Mississippi was prevented from terminating a rape-inflicted pregnancy, forcing her to carry it to term. A 10-year-old girl had to flee across state lines from Ohio to Indiana to have her rape-inflicted pregnancy terminated. Many of the almost 24 abortion bans in effect in this country also have exceptions for rape. But rape isn't always reported. The victim isn't always in a position where they feel it'd be safe to reach out for help, whether they're being molested by their abusive partner or family member, or someone in a position of power over them. This is happening in red states all over the country. And to make matters worse, Trump has come out and endorsed these extreme abortion bans and will keep them in place if re-elected. Biden, on the other hand, signed several executive orders in an attempt to safeguard abortion access, especially emergency abortions that save lives. But there's only so much he can constitutionally do on his own. Democrats passed abortion rights in the House of Representatives when they controlled it in 2022, but the bill failed in the Senate due to Republican obstruction and a conservative Democrat. And now with MAGA extremists in the House majority, a bill codifying Roe into federal law would be dead on arrival. Hell, House Republicans refuse to even protect the right to contraception and IVF access, amidst these freedoms being under assault on the state level, because their tyranny and fecklessness knows no bounds. It's also worth noting that in the Dobbs decision, Justice Clarence Thomas went on to say that the decisions protecting contraception and same-sex marriage must be revisited and potentially stricken down as well, which is why to safeguard these freedoms we have to flip the House back to Democratic control, expand our Senate majority, and re-elect Joe Biden. But Donald Trump represents a threat to our electoral process itself. In the aftermath of the 2020 election, in which Trump lost by 7 million votes, he levied 60 court cases in an effort to overturn the election and even pushed the case to the Supreme Court that was surprisingly unanimously rejected despite having that 6-3 conservative majority. There was absolutely no evidence the election was tampered with. But he didn't care. He's on tape demanding that the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, quote, find 11,780 votes. Just enough to put him above Joe Biden in that state. He pressured his own Vice President, Mike Pence, to unilaterally throw out electoral votes and steal the election for him, which Pence thankfully refused to do. His rhetoric and false claims led to a violent mob attacking the United States Capitol, where police officers were beaten and maced, multiple committing suicide from what they experienced that day. He's vowed to be a dictator who goes after his political opponents because ordinary Americans dared to indict and convict him due to the crimes he committed. He thinks he's above the law. Case in point, Project 2025. A far-right scheme to fire and replace hundreds of civil servants with MAGA minions and transform the executive branch of government to be more powerful than ever before via the direct control of various agencies, even the Department of Justice. Part of his plan has already fallen into place due to the Supreme Court essentially rendering the president a king above the law. They did this by claiming that, quote, official acts related to a president's, quote, core constitutional duties are immune to prosecution. Most disturbingly, they explicitly stated that the president's conduct in relation to the Department of Justice falls under absolute presidential immunity. They said this in defense of Trump nearly firing his Attorney General Bill Barr for not going along with his false claims of election fraud and replacing him with a MAGA minion who would declare the 2020 election rigged and prevent the transfer of power, which was only stopped by countless officials threatening to resign. That's also why this time around Trump is planning on replacing civil servants with insurrectionists from the jump. This is a uniquely enlightening issue to compare the two candidates on, because Biden, who undoubtedly has slowed down in the last 10 years, nonetheless surrounds himself with highly competent staff and cabinet officials, as well as a more than qualified vice president, who helps him make decisions and can take the reins of power if necessary. Trump, on the other hand, will surround himself with no one but yes men who, instead of restraining his worst impulses, will do nothing but kowtow to his erratic decisions. The DOJ is the teeth of the federal government on domestic matters, and the Supreme Court ruled that it falls under the domain of the president without restraint or threat of accountability. So Trump could order his political opponents jailed or assassinated by federal agents, could even use them to stop elections from taking place, or if by the grace of God a legitimate election did take place, Trump or a future Trump-like president could use the DOJ to execute a successful coup rather than a failed one. And if the DOJ can't do the job, directing the military as the commander-in-chief would undoubtedly fall under, quote, official acts as well. He could deploy the military to the streets to round up any and every American citizen who disagrees with him, and put them in concentration camps or do God knows what else to them, and get off scot-free. He could sell pardons for $1 million a pop, and to make matters worse, SCOTUS noted that the motivation behind such actions cannot be questioned in the court of law, and pulled out of thin air new standards for acceptable evidence in any prosecutions for a president's illegal, unofficial acts, stating that actions related to official acts like correspondence with other officials in the administration, various government documents, etc., is not admissible evidence at trial. Let's be clear about who this ruling was made for. Trump, who they hope gets back into power, and who is responsible for 3 of those justices even being on the court. And if elected, he will replace at least 2 of these justices with young, even more extreme lunatics who will use our highest court's power to subject us to their agenda for decades. Let's also be clear about who this decision is not for. Biden, because they know he won't utilize this unilateral power given that he's an institutionalist and decent human being who respects America and our founding ideals of freedom and checks and balances. The only way to remedy these atrocities and to prevent more from occurring is to vote overwhelmingly for Biden and the Democrats, who will reform or even expand the Supreme Court to revive it from the partisan, degenerate state it's in and instead make it the impartial, rational, and sane institution it's supposed to be. Because Biden and the Democrats are committed to preserving our institutions. He signed into law the updated Electoral Count Act, which made clear that the vice president cannot throw out electoral votes like Trump was pressuring Pence to do. And it was Vice President Biden who even certified the 2016 election for Trump after he beat Hillary Clinton. Trump doesn't have that grace, because all he cares about is himself and his own power. But Donald Trump doesn't just threaten democracy in America, he threatens democracy in Europe and the rest of the world. He praises dictators like Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, and Putin. He even withheld military aid from Ukraine to dig up dirt on Joe Biden, which was the reason for his first impeachment. He calls Putin responsible for murdering some 70,000 innocent Ukrainians, quote, smart, and kowtows to him. It in fact wouldn't be surprising if under his leadership he'd force America to switch sides from Ukraine and the rest of the West to the side of evil and tyranny alongside Russia, China, Iran, and others. He's privately expressed the desire to pull America out of NATO entirely, the treaty organization created after World War II that has prevented world wars since. This would embolden Putin to attack another neighbor like Poland, who otherwise he'd be crazy to invade due to NATO's rule that an attack on one is an attack on all, with America armed with the most powerful military in the world against it. This tracked with Trump's comments urging Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want to NATO allies, demonstrating abject cruelty. Russia bombs maternity and children's hospitals, engages in sexual violence against civilians, and once they've murdered and pillaged enough to take control of an area, they then start erasing the very culture of the people of the land they stole. That's what Trump wants to subject our allies to? Biden, on the other hand, has united the world against Russia, and his sanctions have decimated the Russian economy. He's time and time again fought and won the battle for military aid for Ukraine in the face of fierce opposition from Republicans in Congress. He even visited Kiev in the height of the war, becoming the first president in modern history to visit an active war zone not controlled by the US military. Zelensky has thanked Biden and the US for all of our help, but many Republicans spread misinformation about the aid, implying we're sending over millions in blank checks. The fact is, we're sending old military equipment that was set to be destroyed anyway, leading to the revitalization of our own military through replacing them with newer, more effective weaponry, which also benefits the American economy and creates good-paying jobs. If Putin wins in Ukraine, just like if America pulls out of NATO, he'll be emboldened to attack a NATO ally like Poland. Except if he does that without us pulling out of NATO, we could be facing nuclear Armageddon and the end of the world as we know it. Trump could also bring humanity to an end by exacerbating the existential threat of climate change and allowing the corporations that line his pockets to unleash toxic gases and chemicals onto us and our families. He removed countless environmental protections established by presidents before him, including the Clean Air and Water Acts, which Biden thankfully restored when he got back in office. He pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord, which Biden thankfully rejoined on day one. He approved of the Keystone XL pipeline, which Biden canceled on day one. Trump actually asked for $1 billion from the oil and gas industry in exchange for the go-ahead to demolish America's natural environment. Biden is responsible for the largest investment in fighting climate change ever in the Inflation Reduction Act, and now also thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we're transitioning to a clean energy future where we're on track to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by up to 41% below 2005 levels by 2030. And for all of the fossil fuels that are still being used in Biden's America, one thing I can tell you is that Trump would allow far more oil extraction to go on, polluting our environment and worsening the existential threat of climate change. Now, I know some leftists may be watching this thinking, I don't care what Biden did for the environment. I'm not voting for Genocide Joe. I don't think, nor do I think any of you, should have a problem with Israel wanting to eradicate Hamas, the terrorist organization that was elected in 2005 by the people of Gaza, which encroached into Israel on October 7th and brutally murdered over 1,000 people. Most disturbingly, this attack featured terrorists on paragliders who flew into a music festival filled with young people, no different from me and many of you watching this video. And they didn't just end so many lives unjustly. They raped women at gunpoint and then executed them, which was confirmed by a UN report. At least 33 of those slaughtered that day were Americans. So of course Biden wanted to aid the Israelis in eradicating Hamas, because if they're not eradicated, there won't be peace. A ceasefire without dislodging Hamas from the Gaza Strip would only bring more terrorist attacks and in turn more bombing from Israel, leading to violence and destruction on both sides. The problem is the extent of the bombing campaign. Far too many innocent Palestinians and even reporters and workers for the UN have been killed and disenfranchised. I support a far more tactical approach that involved less civilian deaths, although that would be difficult as Hamas hides behind civilians as human shields. Biden has recognized this too, calling Israel's bombing campaign over the top and refusing to supply weapons for Netanyahu's invasion of Rafah. He even got the Israelis to accept a deal that would have led to an end to the war due to Hamas being so badly beaten that their capabilities have been severely diminished. It would have led to a major reconstruction effort of Gaza, and would have freed all of the hostages kidnapped on October 7th. But Hamas rejected the deal, because as is written in their charter, they won't stop until Israel is destroyed and their civilians are humiliated and snuffed out. I don't think Biden's handling of this is perfect, just like how I don't agree with other things like animal agricultural subsidies, which is taxpayers' money that gets allocated to meat, dairy, and egg farmers to make these products cheaper. I think that's abhorrent. I am further left than Biden myself. But voting third party or staying home does nothing but split up the leftist vote, helping Donald Trump reclaim power, which could mean the end of democracy itself. And instead of having a pragmatic politician who can be swayed in either direction, all you'll have is one far-right, childish, uncontested worldview. For example, on this very issue, Trump repeatedly used the word Palestinian as a slur and said Israel should, quote, finish the problem in Gaza, implying the complete annihilation of every innocent civilian within those borders. Incompetence, tyranny, climate change, terrorism. These are the threats we are facing as a country. What isn't a threat is immigrants coming to our southern border, looking for a better life. We are a country of immigrants. That is our strength. It is America's advantage that we bring together people from all walks of life to do their part. Doctors, engineers, caregivers, and more come to this country and make it better. They do not, as Trump says, poison the blood of our country, echoing the rhetoric of Hitler, which isn't surprising, given that immigrants are his marginalized group of choice, just like Jews were for Hitler. He promises to deport millions of immigrants who call this country home, who in many instances have been contributing to our economy for decades. As president, he ripped children away from their parents and stuck them in cages. And yes, Biden repealing that disgraceful policy and setting up an initiative that has reunited families probably contributed to the uptick in border crossings after he was elected, but the fact is this is predominantly caused by a multitude of factors such as the domestic problems going on in these migrants' home countries, most of which relating to crime and economic issues. Another factor is our broken immigration system, which Biden tried to fix and Trump stopped him from doing so. Under federal law, immigrants have the right to asylum, meaning if they come to America looking for a better life, we are legally obligated to let them in and determine whether they should be granted citizenship on a case-by-case basis. Now, this may not seem to be so bad, but when you realize the lack of federal judges and resources we have to process these cases, it's no mystery why there is so much overwhelm. Immigrants are given a court date weeks or even months away just to be released into the country, often to never be heard from again. This is why Trump's border wall, which he redirected funding from our military to build, is so irrational. A border doesn't change the federal law that's been on the books for decades that states that immigrants have the right to asylum. Another law amending the code does. And that's exactly what Biden tried to do. The White House and Senate Democrats partook in intense negotiations with Republican senators, notably James Lankford of Oklahoma, to come up with a deal that would increase the number of federal judges to streamline these cases with earlier court dates to prevent people from going ghost and staying in the country illegally. At best, living and contributing to the American economy with the constant fear of being deported, and at worst, bringing crime and bloodshed much like they did in their home country in the cases of gang members and such. This bill would have prevented chaos at the border by increasing the number of Border Patrol officers and allowing the government to turn away migrants when the sheer amount of daily crossings becomes too much for our officials to handle. They had a deal to solve the issue, but without a problem to attack Biden on, Trump is weaker. So he directed the GOP to sink the bill, and like clockwork, that's exactly what they did. They forced Biden's hand into signing an executive order at the beginning of June that was far more limited in scope, but it nonetheless already has decreased border crossings to a 3-year low. Trump and the Republicans also made us less safe from gun violence. When he was a senator, Biden co-sponsored an assault weapons ban, and when it was in effect, mass shootings dropped. But when Bush Jr. and a Republican Congress let it expire, mass shootings skyrocketed. Fast forward to 2022, and in response to one of the most heinous mass shootings in US history, carried out by a white supremacist at a grocery store in a black community, Biden signed into law the Safer Communities Act, the most significant gun control legislation in 30 years. This bipartisan bill improved the background check system by broadening the definition of licensed gun dealers, established enhanced background checks for gun buyers under age 21, expanded community violence intervention programs, made schools safer, and expanded access to mental health services. He's tried to ban assault weapons again and again since it expired, but that's a step too far for any federally elected Republican because they care more about the NRA's blood money than the blood of American citizens, including our children. That's why Trump, just last January, 36 hours after a school shooting in Iowa, told the afflicted families and victims to, quote, get over it. How would you feel if your child, or any loved one for that matter, was shot and killed at school, and a former president of the United States, who even bragged about doing nothing to prevent that from happening, told you to just get over it? All of this, and the presidential race is close? All of this, and you care about Biden's age or one bad debate performance? All of this, and you stay silent when your Trump-supporting friends and family talk nonsense and support a literal wannabe dictator who has now been given the green light to be a literal dictator his first day back in office? The only way to remedy these atrocities is to speak out on this election, and to make sure we all vote overwhelmingly for Biden and the Democrats this November, who will protect our economy and foster more economic growth, who will restore Roe v. Wade, reform and expand the Supreme Court, protect our environment, humanely secure our border, ban assault weapons, and most importantly, save our democracy, and show Donald Trump that he does not represent who we are as Americans. Rather, he represents the constant force of tyranny, greed, and division in American history that has been pulling us backwards, while others have been marching us towards justice, liberty, making real the promise of America that everyone is inherently valuable and worthy of dignity, respect, and freedom. Please share this video to spread the message, and watch this video next for more political content.